Hello and welcome back. You're watching Parry This. Today we will be continuing our Crusades video series with a video that covers the major events, reasons, and factions that comprise the First Crusade. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, I took a look at all the major chivalric orders of Christian knights, and I invite you to watch them all, for they contain a great amount of interesting facts and information about all these different orders. And remember that videos like this only get suggested if viewers like you interact, so don't forget to hit the like or even dislike button. And if it isn't too inconvenient, drop a Deus Vult down in the comments. But without any further gilding the lily, let's dive on in and learn about the First Crusade. So before we dive into too much quick detail, I'll cover it for those of you that don't like to stick around more than 20 seconds. The First Crusade took place between the years of 1095 and 1099. It was called for by Pope Urban II on behalf of the Byzantines in Constantinople. It was the first in a number of crusades intended to recapture the Holy Lands. It was intended to retake Christian lands lost in the 600s and put a stop to nearly 500 years of Muslim aggression threatening Christian Europe. The fight was between the Crusader side, made up of the Papal States, the Kingdom of France, the County of Flanders, the Holy Roman Empire, the County of Sicily, and the Duchy of Apulia and Calabria. Of course, not the entire army of each of these places, just some of them. On the Muslim side, you had the Fatimid Caliphate and the Seljuk Empire, which by the time of the First Crusade wasn't actually one unified empire, but was broken up into 5 or more different, much smaller kingdoms. But that's only a very high-level overview of the First Crusade. If you want to learn way more interesting facts and details, stick around. And I'll go through everything I have deemed necessary to recount in this video. If you think I've missed something interesting or important by the end, please let me know down in the comments, but don't worry, I probably already have it planned for a future video. So let's start off by discussing the People's Crusade. Pope Urban II planned the departure of the Crusade for August 15th, 1096. Before this, a number of unexpected bands of peasants and low-ranking knights organized and set off for Jerusalem on their own, on an expedition known as the People's Crusade. This was led by a monk named Peter the Hermit. The peasant population had been afflicted by drought, famine, and disease for many years before 1096, and some of them seem to have envisioned the crusade as an escape from these hardships. Spurring them on had been a number of meteorological occurrences, beginning in 1095, that seemed to be a divine blessing for the movement. These included a meteor shower, aurora borealis, a lunar eclipse, and even a comet, among other events. Millenarianism, or the belief that the end of the world was imminent, was widespread in the early 11th century, and it experienced a resurgence in popularity at this time. The response was beyond expectations. While Urban might have expected a few thousand knights, he ended up with a migration numbering up to 40,000 crusaders, of mostly unskilled fighters, including women and children. Lacking military discipline in what likely seemed a strange land, that being Eastern Europe, Peter's fledgling army quickly found itself in trouble, despite the fact that they were still in Christian territory. This unruly mob began to attack and pillage outside Constantinople in search of supplies and food, prompting Alexios to hurriedly ferry the gathering across the Bosporus 1 week later. After crossing into Asia Minor, the Crusaders split up and began to plunder the countryside, wandering into Seljuk territory around Nicaea, where they were massacred by an overwhelming group of Turks. But what else could you expect from a basically unarmed army made up of untrained peasants, mostly women and children, led by a monk? So now let's get into the actual First Crusade, otherwise known as the Princes Crusade. The 4 main Crusader armies left Europe around the appointed time in August 1096. They took different paths to Constantinople and gathered outside the city walls between November 1096 and April 1097. Hugh of Vermandois arrived first, followed by Godfrey, Raymond, and Bohemond. This time, Emperor Alexios was more prepared for the Crusaders. There were fewer incidents of violence along the way. The Crusaders may have expected Alexios to become their leader, but he had no interest in joining them, and was mainly concerned with transporting them into Asia Minor as quickly as possible. In return for food and supplies, Alexios requested that the leaders swear fealty to him, and promised to return to the Byzantine Empire any land recovered from the Turks. Before ensuring that the various armies were shuttled across the Bosphorus, Alexios advised the leaders on how best to deal with the Seljuk armies they would soon encounter, which would prove to be useful intel. And this all leads to the Siege of Nicaea. The Crusader armies crossed over into Asia Minor during the first half of 1097, where they were joined by Peter the Hermit and the remainder of his little army. Alexios also sent 2 of his own generals, Manuel Botamites and Tatikios, to assist the Crusaders. The first object of their campaign was Nicaea, previously a city under Byzantine rule, but which had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum under Kilij Arslan I. Arslan was away campaigning against the Danishmends in central Anatolia at the time, and had left behind his treasury and his family, underestimating the strength of these new crusaders. Subsequently, upon the crusaders' arrival, the city was subjected to a lengthy siege, and when Arslan had word of it, he rushed back to Nicaea and attacked the crusader army on May 16th. He was then driven back by the unexpectedly large crusader force, with heavy losses suffered on both sides in the ensuing battle. The siege continued, but the Crusaders had little success as they found they could not blockade Lake Iznik, which the city was situated on, and from which it could be provisioned. To break the city, Alexios had the Crusader ships rolled overland on logs, and at the sight of them, the Turkish garrison finally surrendered on the 18th of June. The city was then handed over to the Byzantine troops. It's important to note at this point that as soon as they surrendered, they were allowed to leave or stay unmolested as long as the Crusaders could maintain control. That's going to be an important detail to remember for later in the video. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched on through Anatolia. They were accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Tatikios, and still harbored the hope that Alexios would send a full Byzantine army after them. After a battle with Kilij Arslan, the Crusaders marched through Anatolia unopposed, but the journey was unpleasant, as Arslan had burned and destroyed everything he left behind in his army's flight. It was the middle of summer, and the Crusaders had very little food and even less water. Many men and horses died. Fellow Christians sometimes gave them gifts of food or money, but more often than not, the Crusaders simply looted and pillaged whenever the opportunity presented itself. Proceeding down the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders encountered little resistance, as local rulers preferred to make peace with them and furnish them with supplies rather than fight them, which, to be fair, was probably the best option for them, as it not only kept them alive in the short term, but also made them sympathetic when the Christians would once again rule over the land. But now let's talk about the crown jewel itself, Jerusalem, and how Christian forces retook it. On June 7th, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, which had been recaptured from the Seljuks by the Fatimids only a year before. Many Crusaders wept upon seeing the city they had journeyed so long to reach. The arrival at Jerusalem revealed an arid countryside lacking in water or food supplies. Here, there was no prospect of relief, even as they feared an imminent attack by the local Fatimid rulers. The Crusaders resolved to take the city by assault. They might have been left with little choice, as it had been estimated that only about 12,000 men, including 1,500 cavalry, remained by the time the army reached Jerusalem. After the failure of the initial assault, a meeting between the various leaders was organized, in which it was agreed upon that a more concerted attack would be required in the future. On June 17th, a party of Genoese mariners under Guglielmo Imbriaco arrived at Jaffa and provided the Crusaders with skilled engineers, and perhaps more critically, supplies of timber, which they had cannibalized from their ships, with which they could build siege engines. The Crusaders' morale was raised when a priest known as Peter Desiderius claimed to have had a divine vision of Bishop Adhemar, instructing them to fast and then march in a barefoot procession around the city walls, after which the city would fall, following the biblical story of Joshua at the Siege of Jericho. Despite trying the whole fasting and barefoot walking around thing, the walls didn't just fall down. Unfortunately, it was one of those symbolic things where they still had to do the thing even though they did the other thing. So the final assault on Jerusalem began on July 13th. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate while the other contingents attacked the northern wall. Initially, the provincials at the southern gate made little headway, but the contingents at the northern wall fared better, with a slow but steady attrition of the defense. On July 15th, a final push was launched at both ends of the city, and eventually the inner rampart of the northern wall was captured. In the ensuing panic, the defenders abandoned the walls of the city at both ends, allowing the Crusaders to finally enter. What follows is a matter of great contention. When the crusading army had taken the walls and the fight progressed to the inner city, there are many differing historical accounts. There are sources that claim that in a day-long slaughter that followed, Muslims were killed indiscriminately, and a large group of Jews that had taken refuge in their synagogue died when it was burnt to the ground by the Crusaders. However, there are many different versions of these events. The most commonly accepted one is that the fight progressed through the city as the Muslim forces slowly gave ground, fighting the entire way, and most of the casualties were a result of the long protracted fight through the city streets. The idea that the Crusaders were slaughtering innocents that had already surrendered or that they were going house to house killing unarmed families is just ridiculous. Surely there were probably examples of this, but it's highly unlikely that it was a widespread event. However, there are a few historical accounts that do suggest many soldiers had put down their weapons and were still cut down by the Crusaders. However, there are also accounts that show that during the siege and assault stages, the crusading forces repeatedly offered surrender to the Muslim forces, where they could leave without molestation, much like earlier in Nicaea. These offers apparently went all the way up to the night before the final push, where they took the wall. And in this time, the crusading forces said if they had to take the city, any armed forces would be killed without hesitation. So the reports that say soldiers surrendered and were still killed often fail to explain that they had many opportunities to surrender but refused it continuously, only surrendering after they made the Crusaders bleed for every single inch. So it's not hard to believe that the promise of no mercy was followed through on. Totally not justifying slaughtering people that have surrendered. By modern standards, this is a war crime, but back then it was totally normal. For reference, look back to the People's Crusade, where 40,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered mercilessly by the Seljuks. In either case, I believe the quote-unquote slaughter is exaggerated, as after the conquest of Jerusalem, thousands of Muslims and Jews remained living free in and around the Kingdom of Jerusalem, nearly unmolested, which doesn't logically sound like the end result of a day-long slaughter of every Muslim that the evil Christians could get their hands on. But hey, who knows? On July 22nd, a council was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to establish a king for the newly created Kingdom of Jerusalem. Raymond IV of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon were recognized as the leaders of the Crusade and the Siege of Jerusalem. Raymond was the wealthier and more powerful of the two, but at first he refused to become king, perhaps attempting to show his piety, and probably hoping that the other nobles would insist upon his election anyway. The more popular Godfrey did not hesitate like Raymond and accepted a position as secular leader. Having captured Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Crusaders had fulfilled their vow, and most of them returned home, to Europe, leaving only a skeleton crew to maintain the Kingdom of Heaven, which was surely a great decision and wouldn't backfire on them in any way in the future. As a final note, it should be mentioned that the Byzantines were not very happy about the founding of the Crusader states because they wanted their land back out of all of this. But the Crusaders told them to go suck eggs because Western Christendom had done all the heavy lifting, while the Byzantines chilled back in future Istanbul, which would surely never become a Muslim-controlled city. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you both enjoyed this video and were somewhat educated by it. I have many more planned in this series where I will cover many other Crusade-related topics, including important leaders, factions, and other Crusades, and even the Iberian Reconquista, and much, much more. So be sure to subscribe, share the video, and all that good stuff. But in any case, thanks for watching, and have a nice day. I'll see you next time.